today's subject is about making smart business decisions. And I've been thinking about decision making a lot because obviously it's fairly critical for anyone running a business or in leading some element of a business to be reasonably good at making good decisions. So, but that kind of opens a question up to us: is what is a good decision, and how do we formulate decisions? So, what we're going to cover today is, first of all, what is a good commercial decision? What makes up a good commercial decision? So we're going to unpack that language a little bit. We're then going to look at levels of decision making, because obviously decision making is taking place all the time across multiple levels within your organization. And the more senior the person is, in theory, the bigger decisions they're called to make. We're then going to look at what some of the considerations for a good commercial decision are, and what the goal of a good decision is. Obviously, we're going to talk about the role that personal bias plays in decision making and some of the things you can practically do to reduce the level of personal bias so that you make the cleanest decision possible. And finally, I'm going to talk about how you can use the Clean Action framework, which is a framework that any of you that have been on my training programs will already be more than familiar with, as a way of making rounded, well-formed decisions. So as I move through this presentation, these four elements are the elements that I teach in the Leverage Leadership program, that this idea of personal calibration, so calibrating yourself to what's going on around you. Commercial acuity being the awareness of the business environment and the drivers of what makes business work. Clean action is my methodology for planning and executing actions in the business. And connection is my model for how we build relationships, both within and outside of the business, with customers and suppliers, as well as internally. And you can see that all four of these things are critical to good decision making. So you'll hear elements of these models as we move through. But what is a good commercial decision? So let's break down the language of good commercial and decision here. So a decision is a conclusion or a resolution reached after consideration. So there's an implication in there that there is some thinking to be done when we're making a decision. And that thinking, in the context of the commercial domain, has to have a profit element in it, because we make a commercial decision primarily because we're trying to drive commercial outcomes. And whilst profit may not be the direct consequence of the decision, it will always be the indirect or the second order outcome that we're looking for. And obviously a good decision is one that has the required qualities of it. So it's a high standard of decision. And one of the challenges I think we face in the commercial world particularly is balancing the quality of decision making with the time available to actually make the decision. But in my mind, a good decision is one that drives some form of action or resolution. So what's the point of decision making if it then doesn't create action and shift in the business itself? So the goal of a good commercial decision is to maximize the potential for a positive commercial outcome whilst minimizing the risk of a negative one. And I think this is probably true of every decision we make, commercially or not. I mean, I was thinking before I started this webinar about the decisions I'd already made today, consciously or subconsciously. You know, when my alarm went off at 5:30, I made a decision: shall I get up and go to the gym or shan't I? You know, then even as I'm driving my car to the gym, I'm constantly making decisions. And those decisions are either to drive the outcome I want or at least to risk manage negative consequences. So we're constantly making decisions, most of them well below our sort of conscious awareness. And I think in a business, we've got to address decision making at the different levels that it takes place. So at its most basic level, we have transactional decision So these are decisions that tend to relate to specific orders or specific customers or specific situations or people that we find ourselves kind of tangled up in on a day-to-day basis. Moving up a level, there are then operational decisions. So operational decisions are distinctive from transactional in that they are more general. So they will relate to things like rules and processes that we want to operate in the business that kind of make decision making at the transactional level that much easier. So they guide the moment to moment operations. And then above that, we have strategic decisions. So these are decisions that relate to kind of the company's overall focus, and they set the tone for the way the operation should run. So if you like, strategic decisions are the domain of the leadership team. Operational decisions are that kind of management level. And transactional is that day-to-day level. And the idea being that these decisions should be pushed to the lowest part of the organization where they can be effectively implemented. And here's my theory under this. I've been doing a lot of thinking around this because I notice a lot of organizations, a lot of the clients I'm working with, transactional decisions are being taken too high in the organization. They're not being delegated down effectively. And my theory is that that is because we're not so good at making operational decisions. So we're not good at setting policies and processes and rules that then enable people managing day-to-day transactions to make decisions without having to refer upwards. And if there's one domain where I hear this really a lot, it's the domain of pricing and discounting. So I work with lots of companies where it's an interesting one for me in small businesses. I think employees in small businesses have more latitude for decision making than their corporate counterparts. If you worked for Orange, as I did, if you were a call center operator, all of your decision making is rule based and restricted, whereas I think we delegate a little bit more authority in transactional decision making in small businesses. And I think that's a challenge because it means transactional decision making begins to soak up management time. And that means that the operational decisions and the strategic decisions often get missed, or even worse, they are taken with the same level of thinking and analysis as a transactional decision. So if anything, I think this is the old important versus urgent debate. Operational and strategic decisions are important, but they often get overwhelmed by these day-to-day, moment-to-moment decisions. So if there's one thing we could usefully do in companies to make decision-making better, is slow down and begin to focus more on operational and strategic decision-making so that transactional decision-making doesn't have to be escalated up to managers. There are things that have to be considered in decision making, particularly in a business context. And the first one is the fact that we are always in the presence of uncertainty and in the presence of complex variables, many of which that the company doesn't control. So this means fundamentally there's an assumption that has to be embedded into every commercial decision. And that assumption is this might not work, because every meaningful commercial decision we take, to some degree, we will only know if that was a good decision or not after we have enacted and executed it and we started to get feedback. That's when we'll then know whether it was a good decision or not a good decision. And so in the face of this uncertainty and this complexity, we also have to be aware of the law of unintended consequences. And I heard a metaphor just recently for this, which I think is very powerful, which is called the Chesterton fence. So the Chesterton fence is the idea that imagine you bought a new house and you moved into the house, and the first thing you noticed is there was a fence across the middle of the garden. Doesn't seem to serve any purpose. So it might be quite natural to just make a decision to knock the fence down. But the more conservative, considered decision maker would want to understand why the fence was there in the first place before they go knocking it down. So the Chesterton fence is a good metaphor for this law of unintended consequences and making sure we think about decisions in the context of what might happen that we're not expecting to happen. So I want to dip into a little bit of detail because I use this word uncertainty a lot and, stepping into the unknown. So I was trying to find a way of unpacking uncertainty and creating some subsets of uncertainty. And it was actually a book about artificial intelligence that gave me the answer. So when you're trying to code artificial intelligence into a machine, it needs to have some way of navigating the environment it's operating within, and that's what this particular chapter did. And I found this really powerful. So the first element of understanding the unknown before we can make a good decision is to know what we know and know what we don't know. So actually to list out the things that we're absolutely certain, well, sure we know, and the things we don't know, it's a prerequisite for a good decision. Secondly, is to understand what other people or other organizations are in play and to what extent we can predict and control their behavior. Now, that could be competitors, that could be suppliers, customers, our own team members. So we need to map out the things that we know or don't know and the extent to which we can control how others might react to the decision we make. The third thing we need to understand in terms of what we do and don't know is the potential impact of the situation we're facing and the decision we're making on our outcomes. Does this situation have the potential to advance us towards what we're trying to get to, or does it actually present a risk that might take us backwards? So understanding that in the context of decision making is important, as is the degree to which the situation is dynamic or changing. So if we're trying to make a decision, we've got to understand, are we making this decision knowing that what's going on out there is going to change, or we think it's going to be relatively static? And the final element that gives us a bit more detail under the unknown and the uncertainty is the extent to which the situation or the decision is familiar to us. What is our history with this particular type of situation? And do we have enough body of knowledge built up to be able to trust our gut instinct? And I'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. The second thing we have to recognize in any commercial decision is that a commercial decision almost always requires a trade-off. And as a result of that, you can never really make a perfect commercial decision because you'll never quite know what would have happened if you'd have gone a different direction with the trade-offs. And as we covered in the last training module, we're constantly trading off against these four things. So we're trading off decisions against the position of the company in its marketplace, the experience of customers, the economic engine, the level of profitability we're trying to create, and the organization structure we have. So every time we make a decision, at the very least, we need to consider each of these four aspects as part of the decision-making framework. The third element I think is really important here is to recognize that do nothing is always an option, but not always a good one, of course. So it's always possible for us to just do nothing and to carry on as we are. But it's worth recognizing that there is a cost to that too. There is a cost of not taking a decision. And that cost may be simply that you don't know what might have worked, or you won't have the data that you will learn by taking and enacting a decision. And unfortunately, one of the challenges in the commercial world is that we never have 100% of the information we need to make a really good decision. There is always an element of grey in all of our decision making. And this is the dilemma, is that if you don't move because you don't have 100% of the information, you'll never move. And finally, there's the role of personal bias in decision making. And this model will be familiar to many of you. So when you're making a decision, you're involved in a process to make a decision, you have to recognize the presence of these three things. The fact that you have an identity in that decision. There is a you that is involved there, and that you will be thinking about who they are relative to what they're trying to decide to do. So do I think we could do this, or do I think I'm incapable of this? Will this make me look good, or will this make me look bad? Do I have the ability I need, or am I going to balls this up, if you like? The second element of your own personal bias is that all decisions to some degree are shaped by your personal desired outcome. And that will either come into alignment with or be in conflict with the right decision for the company. I see this often, and I see functional bias play up in this a lot. So salespeople will always ask for more leads, or better quality leads, or better pricing options and terms. But that will often conflict with wider company goals and wider company needs. So we have to kind of try to eliminate our own bias and our own desired outcomes, or at least make sure that they're lining up with what the right decision for the company is. And then finally, our bias shows up in the way we view situations. Those of you that came on some of the live events I ran last year will remember the gorilla and the basketball video. So this is a way of showing that we all see the world in subtly different ways. So we always have to gauge the fact that just because we're seeing things a certain way doesn't mean that's how it is, or doesn't mean that our perspective is right. So how do we remove some of this personal bias? Well, practically, the first thing I think we can do is always make sure that we're engaging multiple perspectives. So the more people involved in a decision, the more perspectives you have from which to shape an optimum solution. You can work with a starting assumption that is simply that I am probably wrong about what I think is going to happen. Because let's be honest, in the complex world we live in now, that is almost certainly true. We are almost certainly going to be wrong about what we think is going to happen next. So actually, that's a great supposition from which to start our decision analysis. What if I am wrong? We can also engage in what I call oppositional thinking, which is often what I do with a coach. If you like, this is what you may have heard of as playing the devil's advocate. What about if actually this is a brilliant idea when I think it's a crap idea? Is an important position to hold when you're trying to make a well-rounded commercial decision. And of course, the final thing we can do is to always collect more data. So if in doubt, collect more data is a term I first heard my coach, Joseph Riggio, use with me. So if there is doubt, collect more data, but data might mean just more people's perspectives, more people's opinions, or it might be to go and collect some quantitative data out there in the world that will help us shape the best possible decision. So I wanted to talk a little bit within this about the role of intuition, because intuition is that kind of gut feeling. It's that emotional response that often drives decisions. In sales training, we often talk about that 80% of purchasing decisions are made emotionally, or 80% of the component of the decision is emotion and 20% logic. Now, if you're making a decision about a situation with which you are very familiar and with which you are aware of things that have happened in the past that are identical to this, the chances are your intuition is fairly well tuned in, and it may be good to go with your gut feel. But remember, the world is moving at a very rapid rate. So what worked for your company yesterday is probably not going to work tomorrow, and almost certainly not going to work next year. So actually, by all means, listen to your intuition, but test it with data and test it with alternative perspectives and models. I'm not a fan of when people say I make my decisions based on my gut, or I always go with my gut feeling. You test your gut feeling. You don't trust it because it may be wrong. So what I want to kind of give you in this training session is a really practical tool for making good decisions, bringing into account all of that stuff we've heard about before. And the tool is the tool that I use for virtually everything I do as a business coach and as someone training and developing business leaders. And it's the clean action framework. So here's how we make a good commercial decision. Number one, we start with where do we want to be? What is the outcome we are driving for, both in terms of our outcome personally, our outcome for our customers, and our outcome for the profitability of the company? That's always point number one. What is it we are taking this decision to try to achieve? And the more clarity you have about that, the better. So it's worth spending time, particularly if you're in operational or strategic decision-making mode, to get clear on that. Step two is to then go back to where are we now? So what do we have around us right now that is going to either help us move towards that outcome or is going to impede us? And what I found is a good decision emerges in the tension between these 2 points. Because if a good decision is a decision that results in action, motivation has to play a role in the decision making itself. You know, it's not just good enough to go, right, the right decision to do is this. The right thing to do for the business now is to implement this strategy. If you're then not going to have the motivation or the will to execute the strategy itself. So we've got to be clear about where are we now and where do we want to be. Then within that creative tension, the logical next step will often present itself. The next logical action becomes apparent, and the decision becomes about, do we take that next step? But of course, we also have to be mindful that whatever that next step seems, although that may seem sensible to us at the point of the decision, we also have to acknowledge that this might not work. So what are the potential obstacles that might stop this working should become part of the decision-making process, as should, how the hell are we going to measure what we're doing to make sure, number one, we're doing what we said we were going to do, and that number two, the doing of that is giving us the movement towards the outcome we want. This is a great framework for making a decision. It's a 5-step process that if you logically work through, it's not that you're going to make perfect decisions every time. That's not available to us in the commercial world, but it means you're going to narrow the odds that you're going to get it wrong. And you're also going to increase the odds that it may deliver the outcome that you want, just by introducing this level of thinking before we make a decision. Because, by the way, in my mind, once a decision is made, that's the end of it. I have a saying in sales training, I teach salespeople, targets are not negotiable. You can negotiate in the setting of the target, but once the target or the plan or the decision is in place, you move forward. And I always remember this at Tesco's. I may have told some of you this story about, my boss told me that the boardroom was a place of absolute violence when they were in the debate about what to do. The retail director would argue with the commercial director, who would argue with the finance director. He said it was a very aggressive, hostile environment. But when a decision was made, everyone galvanized around it and moved forward, and it became all about execution. So once a decision is made, the decision is finished. All we do then is we then monitor the execution of the action behind the decision and work out whether we need to calibrate and adjust, and whether we need to come to a point where we have to make a new decision. And there's one other very simple model I want to share with you that I think can be so helpful in terms of decision making. And that's the old Rudyard Kipling poem. I keep 6 honest serving men that taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. So if you can't answer these 6 questions in any decision you're making, the chances are you just haven't thought things through at a level where you know a good decision is going to emerge. So the what is, what are we trying to achieve? What are the outcomes we're trying to reach? The why is that outcome important to us? You know, what is the risk that we're trying to manage, or the reward that we're trying to reach for? Is it that we're trying to move our business away from a danger or from a current poor state? Or is it that we're trying to move in a new direction to new possibilities and new outcomes? When, of course, is when do we need to make a decision and execute a decision? And we need to be mindful within the when that do nothing option is ever present, but there is a consequence generally to delay as much as there is a consequence to a wrong decision. So this balance of the precision of our decisions versus the amount of time we have available to make the decision becomes critical. And again, that's why you've got to focus on pushing transactional decision making down to the lowest level possible in the organization, so your managers and your leadership team are not tied up responding to transactional questions. The next question, which is often relevant, is the how. How are we going to do this? How do we enact this decision, or how do we make this decision? And this is a decision of methodology. So there might be some constraints or some rules. You know, for example, we want to double productivity in the factory, but we don't want to kill anyone in the doing of that. So, you know, the how often introduces the constraints and the rules by which we drive for the outcome. The where is, of course, a geographical question which may or may not be relevant in any particular decision. And the who is the interesting one. Who needs to be involved in the decision, needs to be part of the decision-making process, who needs to be informed of the decision, and who needs to be influenced to support the decision and to make the decision work or present the best possible chance of working. So what I've kind of taken you through there is some ideas around commercial decision making, around what makes a good commercial decision, and some frameworks that you can practically apply that will help you in the day-to-day. And for some of you, I know damn well this is a refresher. This is something you think, oh man, we've been through this before. But use the framework, use the clean action model, use 6 serving men. I promise you, even that will make for much better decisions on a moment-to-moment basis. But I think the key takeaway from me is to make decisions at the right level of the organization, and to always make sure that decisions are made at the lowest point they can reasonably be made within an organization, so that you don't choke up all of the time that should be put into strategic and operational decision making. We often get confused with whether we've made a decision, whether we've just not taken action. And this is an important distinction. You know, a decision is the point at which we decide what we are going to do. That is the end of the decision-making process. The actual doing of it is execution. And it's dangerous to get these two confused, because I often hear people say to me, I haven't made my mind up about this yet, or I haven't decided this yet. But actually, that's not true. You have decided. What you haven't done is acted, is taken an action on the decision itself. So I want you to make sure that distinction is relatively clear in your mind in the decisions that you make, because we get into these loops in companies where we make a decision, we communicate it out, we assume that it's going to be acted on, and then we find out 3 weeks, a month down the line that no one's done anything, and we get confused with, well, did we make a decision? Now, this, by the way, is also a consequence of making decisions at a transactional level. Oh, we've got a particular problem with a customer, so we're going to do this, and in future we should always do this, and then assume that everyone understands that as an operational decision when in fact it was held at a transactional level. So just getting clear about the distinction between decision and action is really important for you in terms of becoming effective leaders, is making sure, no, we've made a decision. Now we've got to make sure we execute on the decision we've made, that we don't keep kind of moving the decision along with our own inaction, if you like. is trying to reconcile what's commercially right